Here we go. Ready? No. Good morning. Many years ago, when I was Director of Library Development for the Maryland State Library, we did a year-long Leadership Institute. We had workshops and conferences and meetings and discussions and training, and libraries from all over the state sent their staff that they thought would be future leaders. One of the librarians was Charlie Robinson. He's the director, at that point, he was director of the Baltimore County Public Library. And he was sort of a strong opinion person. And I asked him, Charlie, what do you think about our Leadership Institute? And this is what Charlie said. The essence of leadership is the communication of commitment. I loved that. Let me read it again. The essence of leadership is the communication of commitment. And that's the point I'm trying to get across in this presentation and in the paper that I wrote, is that it's the role of the leader to work to decide what should be done in the library and commit to doing it, and then influence, motivate staff to do the same thing. I have 4 caveats I want to share before I go into the rest of the PowerPoint. First, what is a library leader? A library leader, in my opinion, there's not that much difference between director and managers. They both have to be visible leaders, moving the association further, the organization, the library, further towards its goals of what it wants to accomplish. So throughout this, I'm going to refer to libraries, to the leaders as library leaders in this presentation. Secondly, accessibility and inclusion. When I started, I was looking at accessibility. But as I did more research, I realized that inclusion is as important as accessibility. Accessibility is being able to get in and do something. But inclusion is an entire mindset of what you want to accomplish in involving all members of the community, regardless whether they have a disability. Inclusion is broader than just accessibility. Third, opinion and research. I've been in this profession over 50 years, and I have a lot of experience both as a leader and as a manager. And I'm sharing those experiences with you. But I also did a lot of research and learned a lot of new things that I actually hadn't been aware of in this arena. So I'm going to share both of those with you. Now, I'm not including any of the links to the research in the PowerPoint. You're going to have to go to the document, the paper that will be part of the publication about this to see what all of the links are. And finally, a lot of this is built on the new Library Services to People with Special Needs section checklist on accessibility. The full title is Everyone is Welcome at the Library, a checklist and best practices for inclusive and accessible library services. I want to start with what I think is the primary message I want to deliver today and in the paper. It's easy to get in the weeds and talk about how a children's librarian can do a story hour for autistic children. But I want to focus at a much higher level, and that is this role of library leaders. And so here are some basic principles. Communicate that all people, including people with disabilities, have value and are respected and openly welcomed in the library. This is a lot of where universal design will come in making sure that everything you do is open and accessible to all members of the community. Second, be explicit and specific about accessibility and inclusion for people with disabilities. Be specific about what it is you want to accomplish, how you want people to be included, and then expect that to happen from staff, from leadership and from staff. All communication should send the message that accessibility and inclusion are part of the vision, mission, values, and operation of the library. And this is at 2 levels. The first is actually making sure the message itself indicates this value. And second, that everything is accessible. That way you're living what you say. A next primary message is that accessibility and inclusion should be part of all policies, budgets, staffing, and planning. not something added on at the end, but something that happens right from the beginning of all of your planning. Next, give staff the skills they need to deliver what you want to have happen. They may not have those skills when they start working at your library. They may not have the education, they may have biases, they may not have understanding, they may not have skills to deliver. This is your role to make sure that they get those, or at least they're given the opportunity to. If they don't take them and they don't want to be respectful of everyone who uses the library and serve everyone that uses the library, then perhaps they should seek work someplace else. Next, input is welcome from staff and library users, and issues and transgressions will be addressed. That you take seriously all comments, all suggestions, and analyze whether or not they might be possible to better serve your people with disabilities. Finally, walk the talk, model the desired behavior and attitude. If you're showing what you mean, if you're actually doing what you mean, then your staff will follow. There's a little bit about the scope of disabilities worldwide. This is difficult. The World Health Organization says that there are 15% of the world's population have a disability, but they only look at people who are deaf, blind, in wheelchairs, and with an IQ less than 75. We know there are more people than that. They also make the point, all of the resources over and over again, that poverty increases the challenges of people with disabilities. Third world countries have the least amount of services for people with disabilities. And those people have the least access to any of those resources. That is a whole different presentation and PowerPoint. So we're going to talk mainly about what second and third and first world countries can do in serving the people with disabilities in their countries. The Center for Disease Control in the United States estimates that 25% of the population have a disability, but this is a much broader definition. This includes anyone with a walker or a cane, anyone who's wearing hearing aids, not who are just deaf, people with cataract surgeries in their eyes, and it also includes cognitive disabilities like autism and dyslexia. The European Union estimates that Croatia has over 33% of the population with some sort of a disability. And if you want to read more about how they define that, you can see the resource in the paper. What are the implications for library leaders? Well, there may be a lot more people out in your community that are that need some assistance from you than you're currently serving. That this is a population that is often hidden. You don't know always whether or not people have a disability. I have dyslexia, but you wouldn't know that unless you work closely with me and know what my learning limitations are. So this is something that you should be aware of, that there are people in the community that might need it. I want to just talk briefly about the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. This was created by the United Nations. The purpose of the convention is to promote, protect, and ensure the full and equal enjoyment of all human rights and fundamental freedoms by all persons with disabilities, and to promote respect for their inherent dignity. Now, it goes on with a lot of detail about how this applies to a lot of different parts of accessibility and inclusion, but this is the main purpose, that everyone is treated equally. It was endorsed by the United Nations in 2007, and Croatia endorsed it in 2007. Now, the United States still has not. We are a country with, each state has its own policies, and they have been unwilling to be guided by the United Nations in this area. However, we do have our own. Now, the role of libraries in implementing the CRPD in Article 9 on accessibility calls for libraries to support people with disabilities to ensure their access to information, promote and create new information and communication technologies and to share those. So that really looks at a leadership role for libraries. Many countries also have legal rights in their constitution or in laws that prohibit discrimination. Most of this data doesn't agree. It's all over the map because some countries are real inclusive, like the United States with its Americans with Disability Act covers pretty much the whole world of discrimination. But some are very specific and only cover employment or access to education or accessibility of facilities. It's good news that 177 countries have signed the CRPD. More important is that libraries implement the spirit of the law rather than just the letter of the law. You can just do the minimum requirements and that's it. But that's not really what the spirit says. To be truly committed and to accessibility and inclusion, you have to look at what all your library can do to make people feel included and be able to use your library. One of the most important areas recently has been a change in perspective from the point of view that that disability is the problem of the individual. And the library will do what it can to help the individual solve the individual's problem. It now has been changed to more that the fact that someone can't use your library is not their fault. It's your fault. That the library creates barriers to equal access, and it is the library's responsibility to remove those barriers so that people can use the library equally. There's been a lot of talk about special needs. We have to help people with special needs. The Down Syndrome Foundation has a number of really good videos that say just what is a special need? And to me, from a library's point of view, it's not a special need that people need to get into the library easily without steps or heavy doors. It is not a special need that people need to sit down at a computer and use it the same way anyone would use it. It's not a special need that people should be able to access the information you have online or the resources that you have in the building, regardless, and that different formats ought to be available. This is not a special need. This is a need that everybody has, people with and without disabilities. I'm going to briefly talk about, I want to talk about the role of partnerships. And I'm going to talk about the role of leadership roles of library leaders. But I want to start with partnerships. One of the things that the disabled community often says is nothing about us without us, meaning that libraries, all organizations, should form partnerships with representatives of disability organizations and disability rights groups. So what's the role of the leader in that? The role of the leader is to take the initiative in establishing that relationship, to reach out to the disability groups, to say publicly that the library is committed to working with disability groups to help them. And now that library might assume a lesser staff person to be the representative to that group, but that staff person and that organization needs to know that when the library director says, we will do whatever we can, that they mean it, and that the library's representative has the authority to commit the library to a whole range of new services. Now there's some that they may need to go back and talk to the director about, but basically that they have the authority to commit the library. And this also has the ability of one of the benefits is that these organizations can then support the library in its goals, particularly budget requests. There are a lot of other leadership roles, and again, it's easy to get down into exactly how something's done, and I really want to focus more on the leadership role. What's the leadership role in these areas? In the area of mission and values, if you're establishing those, you're doing strategic planning, annual plans, you want to make sure that you include the public and people with disabilities in all of those. If you're doing focus groups, you may want to have a focus group of people with disabilities, but you also want to make sure, if you have a focus group with parents, that those parents are in there. You also want to include them in education, for example. Library policies, ask staff to review all policies for possible bias and get input from your disability partners. They will see things that are discriminatory that you do not. In terms of priorities, show your commitment by including accessibility and inclusion in all of your priorities of budget, staffing, and operation. And I've talked about universal design. All right, staff training. Assess the possible bias of your staff. Again, it might be ignorance, just lack of knowledge, lack of experience, but know what it is, know where they are, and then decide how to best help them learn what they need to learn. Provide training on different disabilities and involve people with disabilities in the actual training. For a while, there was a technique called Immersion, where you got into a wheelchair and rolled around the library to understand what people in wheelchairs were like, felt. Or you put on blinders or earmuffs to try and recreate that. Doesn't work. And the disability community is very much against it. What they say is that you can't learn what it's like to live a whole life in a wheelchair by spending an hour in it in a library building. What they do suggest is that you have people with disabilities do an audit, a library audit, and then come to your staff meeting and talk about this. This is what it's like to be in a wheelchair in this building. This is what it's like to be deaf. This is what I can do. This is what I cannot do. And this really opens the eyes of people. Same is true for the hidden ones of autism or dyslexia, to have someone come in and try and read your signs and understand why that's difficult. You should really consider, not just consider, you should hire staff with disabilities. Review your hiring policies and job descriptions. Focus on what needs to be done, not how it should be done. Because people with disabilities may have very creative ways of solving problems. In fact, there's a belief called social model of leadership, which basically says that people with disabilities have spent their life facing challenges and solving problems, and that they can do that, and they're they have a lot of perseverance, and that they can do that for your library in ways you never expected, that there's a great deal of benefit from hiring people with disabilities. And you should integrate staff through training, through leadership development, not just allow, but encourage people with disabilities to go through leadership training, and to have role models of people with disabilities and peer relationships. One new program is that every new staff person has a library staff partner who helps them learn about the library. This should be done for all new staff, so that people with disabilities don't be singled out as someone who needs special attention. And people with disabilities can be that partner for non-disabled people who are new. Establish an inclusion coordinator or team. There are many libraries now that have equity, diversity, and inclusion staff. Often this focuses on hiring people of color because those are the people that also have been discriminated against. But too often, focusing on those people has limited the attention given to people with disabilities. So make sure people with disabilities are included. The role of a library association, quickly, you can be a leader, modeling an accessible conference by choosing an accessible venue. IFLA doesn't always do this. Include accessibility information on the conference website, in the content, train speakers, how to do a PowerPoint, and include accessibility in the conference evaluation. I'm not going to talk too much about COVID. It has allowed more opportunities for some people to participate, particularly online, but I want to talk about it particularly in the area of work. One of the things that happened in COVID is more people worked at home. And this increase in people working at home is continuing after COVID seems to be going away a little bit. It's a wonderful opportunity for people with disabilities. They don't need to figure out how to travel to a work site. They can apply and interview online, and many of the national application interviewing companies are providing software that allows people with disabilities to apply and interview more easily. And the big thing is it allows you to focus on the work, not the disability. If the product is good, their work is good, they're producing good, who cares if they're in a wheelchair? Who cares if they're blind? The focus is on the outcome, not on the disability itself. And this means that the library should be looking at what are the jobs in the library that can be done at home. You know, public service cannot, but cataloging could, archiving materials, digital transition, something like that, perhaps those could. We are doing new guidelines. The IFLA section on library service to people with special needs, and yes, we're considering changing the name, is publishing Everyone is Welcome at the Library, a checklist and best practices for inclusive and accessible library services. And it covers all areas of library service and all types of disabilities and what their needs might be. In conclusion, I want to quote this. The problem is not the person's disability. The problem is society's view of the person's abilities. And I like this as a kind of a motivator that we need to make it possible for people, all people, to use all of their abilities when they're in the library and not just focus on what they can't do because they might have a disability. Thank you very much.